Hello everybody, today we're going to be doing a comparison video on the Strymon BigSky and the Alexander Pedals Space Force. Now, the reasoning for this comparison video is honestly to try to help out some people that are thinking about upgrading to a bigger full stereo reverb with MIDI control, presets, the whole nine yards. This is just kind of showing you the different options that you could have. The Space Force being a pedal for $230 around in there. And then the BigSky, of course, new. It's still above $400 used, still above $350, honestly. It's held its value pretty well over the years. It has obviously been out for some time, and it has just been a great pedal. It's a staple on a ton of big boards and still is being used to this day. I just wanted to really show off the Space Force just for people like me, honestly, that had the BigSky maybe or saving up for the BigSky, but only realistically using 1 to 2 to 3 settings on it. I often found that I only had 4 different algorithms I was using on the BigSky with the Magneto, linear, reflections, bloom, Chorale. I never touched those. They honestly were not something I ever found that I needed or used in my style of music and what I was playing. To justify having that big of a pedal taking up room on my board just wasn't making sense anymore. And I saw Mark Johnston's video on the Space Force, and honestly, I was blown away with how good it sounded. And once I found out it was full stereo and fully MIDI controlled, I was sold. Now, there is a big downside, and that is presets. The Space Force only has 32 presets to the BigSky's 300 presets. So if you're someone that likes saving a bunch of different sounds and someone that has to have a ton of presets ready to go, then obviously the BigSky is going to be something you need to look into. But if you're like me and you only really have 4 or 5 go-to reverb sounds for your different styles, I mean, you really can't go wrong with the Space Force. Especially when you're somebody that's using a MIDI pedal to control everything. I never touch the foot switches on any of my pedals anymore. So I didn't need the 3 foot switches to quickly jump between different sounds. I'm just going to kind of go through the BigSky's sounds, the algorithms, just one by one, just going through each one and then showing the Space Force equivalent of that, I guess. Now, there will be some sounds that the Space Force obviously doesn't have that the BigSky does. The BigSky has 12 algorithms, while the Space Force only has 8, and they are different. First of all, let's just go ahead and run through the specs of each pedal and what those different algorithms are. So on the BigSky, you obviously have 3 big foot switches that are right there for you to be able to bank up, bank down, and control 3 different presets at once. Now, obviously, you can only fire 1 preset at once, but you just have the option to quickly switch between them without having to do too much tap dancing. You have stereo in and stereo out, as well as a MIDI input and a MIDI through. Now, the BigSky's 12 algorithms are room, hall, plate, spring, swell, bloom, cloud, Chorale, shimmer, Magneto, NonLinear, and reflections. Now, onto the Space Force. You have 2 foot switches, and to go through your presets, which on board on the pedal without any MIDI help, you can access 8 of those at once. So you can scroll through 8 and then it'll wrap back around. And then you can choose to access a different 8 in any part of that pedal. Now, with MIDI, you can go through all 32 without any trouble whatsoever. To get through the presets, you hold down the bypass button, and that will cycle through your preset, or you hold down on both to go backwards. Something else the Space Force has is a ramp control and a control foot switch, which is for tapping in tap tempo for your modulation effects, and even the delay effect that is in the Echoverb. Now, it is also good to note that the Space Force is also full stereo in and out, but to have stereo input, you will need a TRS to TRS if you're going between Alexander pedals, or you will need a TRS to dual TS cable. So in this video, I will be featuring the Space Force a little bit more, and that's just because this is the pedal that I have decided to move on to from the BigSky. For me, it's just a smaller pedal so I can fit my final few pedals that I want on this board. It has all the presets that I'll need, has full MIDI control. So it does everything I need it to, and that's why I'm moving onto it from the BigSky. And so I'll just kind of show some more of the Space Force's features. Obviously, if you want to hear the BigSky and want to see what it can do, there's a million videos out there by now about it. And there's not a ton of videos out there about Space Force. You can find some really good ones, especially as I mentioned, the Mark Johnston one. Now, I did want to feature kind of how you go through menus on each of these pedals. I'll kind of show it. I'll maybe try to zoom in. But on the BigSky, obviously, you have all of these options on every setting. So you have your decay, your pre-delay, your mix, modulation, parameter 1 and 2, and tone control. Now, parameter 1 and 2 do change per setting. It depends on what one you're on. Most of the time, parameter 1 is always a low-end control. And then parameter 2 will change something different. Like on this room, it is showing you the size of it, either a studio or a club size. There is a bit more control as far as editing your sound, taking out highs, adding in lows, taking out lows that you can achieve on the BigSky. And if you're someone that's very mixing minded and very sound minded and you want to have those very minor tweakable things, the BigSky is obviously going to be your first choice. But if you're like me, you don't really care too much about those. As long as you can get the sound you want, you don't need to add a specific amount of low end. Or I never honestly have adjusted my low end settings at all on the BigSky. And honestly, most of the settings, the deep settings in the BigSky, I really haven't adjusted. And that's partially because they're kind of hard to get to. To go through your parameter settings, you have to click on that, and then you have to go through find, diffusion, boost. You have to go through the menus, and there is a lot of menus on the BigSky. And I think that is a big complaint with a lot of people with the BigSky and the Timeline, the Mobius, all of those big box Strymon pedals, is they really do give you options paralysis every once in a while. There's just sometimes too many options, too many tweakable knobs that you just get lost and you just kind of get overwhelmed. And I definitely have found that in editing. Most of my settings and most of my sounds that I have on there and have been using, I just downloaded from somebody else because it was just such a big task to dial in that sound that I wanted when there was just so many options to achieve that. Now, I went ahead and got a lot closer on the Space Force because most of it does take place on this screen. And honestly, one of the things about this pedal, the screen is pretty small. If you have a hard time seeing or you have worse eyes like mine, I had to wear glasses, sometimes it is kind of hard to see what setting you're on. But that's why I use a MIDI controller. My MIDI controller, if I click a button, I know it's going to go to the correct setting. I don't really have to fiddle with the actual pedal itself to figure out where I'm at or what's going on. On the Space Force, you have 4 knobs, and they all do different things depending on what page you're on. And this is something that I have found is so easy to use the Space Force. It's so fast to tweak, and it's so quick to just find the sounds that I want. There are a couple of complaints I have with the pedal, and that is whenever you're adjusting through the pages. So you have 3 pages on every setting, all of them. Most of the time, the first page is going to have the same settings. The second page is really going to be where it's different. And then the third page is almost always the same with your ramp controls, which I'll show off a little bit later, level, and then either your delay time or your algorithm's modulation setting. Now, the one problem I do have with this, as you can see on this setting, the reverb is all the way down. Now, if I'm at this point on the pedal and I do this, it obviously automatically jumps up to wherever this knob is. And I wish you had the option to do more of a pickup setting to where, like, if it was all the way down, I'd have to turn this pedal down and then adjust it. That way, whenever you are messing with a sound and you're on this page and you're tweaking something on here, then you go back to that first page, you're not now jumping and like, oh crap, where was that setting at? I needed to adjust it from that point. So obviously that's a small complaint I have, and it could be fixable with a software update, I'm sure. But I'm not sure if that's something that they're looking into or not. So with that being said, we're going to go ahead and move on to the sound portion of this video. All right, so for my clean sound, I have the Jackson Audio Bloom into the Jackson Audio Prism preamp pedal into the Worst Audio ACS1 with a dual Fender Deluxe reverb sound. Okay, first off, here is the room sound on the BigSky. All right, next up, Space Force. All right, next up is the hall sound, once again, starting with the BigSky. Okay, next up, Space Force. Okay, next up is Plate. All right, now next up, the Space Force. All right, now the spring. Space Force. All right, so next up we have the bloom setting on the BigSky. Now I went ahead and did a full wet bloom. So this will just be a guitar swell, and the same with the Space Force. Now the Space Force. All right, now we have the second setting of the swell on the BigSky, and then we have the sort of the same setting, the dynamic setting on the Space Force. This is where I'll play cleanly, and then the reverb will swell in after my playing. Now Space Force. Now, I will note there is a volume drop on the Space Force in this setting. I'm not 100% why. I'd have to probably tweak around with the settings a little bit more to figure that out. But that is just one thing to note. Okay, now next up is this setting, the bloom setting. And on the Space Force, I couldn't quite replicate it just as good as the BigSky does it. But this is also a setting I've never touched on the BigSky. But this is where the delay comes in after your dry signal, sort of like the last one we just had, but a little bit more separated, I would say, on the BigSky. Then here's the Space Force equivalent of that. Not quite close, but... So that's just almost a side note sound, just trying to find something that matched. But honestly, the bloom on the BigSky, for what it is a great sound, and you just can't quite replicate it on the Space Force. Moving on. All right, so up next is the cloud setting on the BigSky. Onto the Space Force. Okay, now these next two sounds are two unique sounds that each pedal has. For the BigSky, this is the Chorale sound, and then on the Space Force, it will be their lo-fi sound. Here is the Chorale sound on the BigSky. Very interesting sound. I've never actually used it in a practical sense, but kind of fun to mess around with from time to time. Now here is the Space Force lo-fi sound. And what that is it has a dirt setting to it that you can turn up and just kind of get that lo-fi shoegazy sounds. Honestly, a really cool sound. You can kind of crank it and get really nasty with it, and I may show that off a little bit later in the video. All right, now next up is the shimmer effect. Now this is definitely also another place where these two pedals are pretty different. If you're like me, shimmer isn't something I really use a ton anymore. I think back in the early 2000s, it was definitely one of the big reverb sounds that every worship guitarist wanted on their board. Some people even buying, the Nuneber Wet that had an amazing shimmer sound on it. I believe the RV5 had a really great one too. This is just something I don't use anymore, so for me, losing this style of a shimmer effect wasn't a big deal. But if this is your thing, of course, BigSky does it amazingly. Now here's the Space Force equivalent of that with their pitch reverb. One thing I will note about the Space Force is it sounds like the pitch is more applied to your dry sound versus to the wet part of it. All right, now here's Magneto. Now this is getting to the settings that I never touched on the BigSky. My main settings were the room, hall, plate, spring, and cloud setting. The Magneto, I honestly couldn't even remember quite what it did. Here's just a sound I got with it. It honestly is like you take delays and it's creating a reverb effect through the delays of that sound. And honestly, I picked that sound of the Magneto and dialed that in because on the Space Force, they have the analog algorithm, which is exactly that. It is the old delay chipsets that people would use for the reverbs, the very first reverbs. Very cool sound. All right, now here's the non-linear sound on the BigSky. Again, not one of the pedals sounds that I have a ton of experience with. And this is kind of a gated verb, just because it's also something I was able to replicate on the Space Force. There's a lot of different things you can do with the non-linear. It's a very interesting algorithm. I just did not ever mess with it very much. Then here is that sort of that sound on the Space Force. Next up is the reflection sound on the BigSky, which it's almost a room emulator. You can pick an oval, rectangle, square, a very tight room sound to me. I'm sure there's some other sounds you can get out of it, and to me, it just sounds like a very tight room sound. I'm sure there's a lot of different ones, and a lot of you BigSky enthusiasts that are like, no, that's not what it should be. That's not what it is. But for me, this is the sound I dialed in, and yeah, here it is. All right, and then the last sound on the Space Force we're going through today is called the Echoverb, and it is a delay into a reverb. So with this, you get just a straight up delay pedal added on to the reverb for free. You can slow down that. All right, now I'm going to kind of show off some of the features on each pedal that just really showcases their differences and some of the pros and cons of what they can do. Which, first off, with the BigSky, one massive pro is it has an amazing cloud. It can get super, super ambient. So, like, this was the cloud one that I previously had on it. But just to kind of show you how ridiculous this thing can get, you have 50 seconds of decay on this. It is honestly quite ridiculous. And that is one thing that I found the Space Force just can't quite replicate, is the absolutely massive reverbs that the BigSky is able to pull. Especially with this cloud algorithm. Now, the Space Force does have several different algorithms that can get pretty big, and I'll kind of show you that now. So with this cloud-ish setting, this is actually the pitch algorithm, and it is a cathedral style reverb. Obviously, the sound that I had dialed in on it was this. Which is a pretty long tail on that reverb. But we can also get some pretty big, this is as big as you can go without going into the hold setting. And then let me turn on that mix. That mix is pretty low. So obviously you can get pretty big. But I just think the BigSky kind of has that little bit of a hold over the Space Force with just how smooth, and that cloud algorithm is just so nice. But honestly, I'm pretty happy with this setting on the Space Force as a cloud type setting, just because for my applications, I have a swell setting on here that just sounds absolutely huge. It does everything that I needed the BigSky to, and I think it sounds great. One more feature I did want to talk about with the Space Force is the ramp feature. This is built into every algorithm, and it basically gives you the ability to create 2 presets in one. So you hold down this button to do your ramp control, and if you have it on toggle, whenever you ramp up, you can make all your setting changes. Then you ramp it back down, make all your setting changes, and now you have 2 separate sounds. So like I have this cloud sound right now that's on the pitch algorithm. But then if I do this ramp control, that is honestly one of the most unique features I've found on a pedal. It is just a cool way to get completely different sounds out of your existing pedal. I kind of want to show it with this rewind real quick, just to kind of illustrate better how that sounds. All right, so on this rewind, so we're now on this rewind pedal, just real quick, just to kind of show you the ramp features and just how smooth it can be while you're playing. Here's just a sound I have this is completely clean. But then I hold down the ramp feature, or through MIDI control, I just fire it. And instantly I have this old cassette warbly sound. And strip it back. And we're back to clean sound. Space Force has this. I haven't made any sounds that really feature that as well as that cassette sound. It's just a very cool feature to have and a very unique part of the Space Force that I think just sounds so smooth.